And now, today, I want you to know Jeremy Lent, though many of you know him very, very well. Jeremy is described by The Guardian, by the journalist George Monbiot, as, and I quote, one of the greatest thinkers of our age. Jeremy has done many presentations for the Center for Process Studies over time, and he has also been an active part in some of the courses. In my last two courses on ecological civilization, he came as a guest, and the students were fascinated by him because he is a provocateur and a deep, deep thinker. As an author and speaker, he focuses on the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis, and he explores pathways toward a flourishing future. His presentation today is going to be a wonderful bridge between what we heard from Mary Evelyn Tucker last week and what we'll hear from the performative philosophers of next week. His award-winning book is The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. This book examines the way that humans have made meaning from the cosmos, from the time of the hunter-gatherers to the present day. His more recent award-winning book is The Web of Meaning, and the subtitle is Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. This is at the heart of everything he does. He's written extensively about the vision that he holds and the spirit of an ecological civilization. He's the founder of the Liology Institute, Liology, which integrates system science and ancient wisdom. He also founded the Deep Transformation Network, a global community exploring pathways toward a life-affirming future for the Earth. He has a book coming soon, and its title is Eco-Civilization, subtitle, Making a World That Works for All. Jeremy, you are such a gift, and we thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us the time. Jeremy, we're all yours.
Well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Mary Elizabeth. And yeah, I'm so glad to be back here with the process group because I feel so connected with your work and really delighted to hear that Mary Evelyn Tucker had been just talking with you recently because yeah, what she talks about, what I talk about, very, very related thematically. So it seems like a great follow-on. Really glad for that. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to share with you like a PowerPoint kind of presentation, probably for maybe like 35 or so minutes. So I'm going to share the screen right now. And what we'll be talking about today is this theme of envisioning an ecological civilization, both in theory, we'll give some theory around that, and practice. So it's not just these kind of conceptual ideas. You see the subtitle, How We Can Make a World That Works for All. And in fact, I've just completed writing the manuscript for a book that will be published next May by Melville House on this very topic. It's called Eco-Civilization, Making a World That Works for All. So that's not just a coincidence. So this really gives you a little bit of a taste of what I've been spending years of my life really delving into and looking forward to sharing with you and others when the book comes out in a more detailed way. So let me begin. And I'd like to begin with kind of starting off with really the big picture, if you will. And well, of course, we all recognize this picture, one of the classic pictures of our age, the Earth. And it was the first picture taken of the Earth, like the sort of moonrise. Um, and the beautiful thing about this picture is this beauty of this living orb and the sense of this kind of vast, infinite space all around it. And I think this is a core theme through everything we're looking at. This wonderful miracle of this planet. It's the only place that we know of in the universe right now where life exists. What an incredible miracle for us to be born in this space. And it was actually quite early on in our Earth's history that life emerged, just a few 100 million years after the Earth itself got formed as a sphere. And it's been going now for like basically over 4 billion years. And in that time, it grew to take over this entire Earth with this richness, this abundance. And then it's only been in a very recent time in the Earth's history, the last maybe up to 100,000 years or so, that a particular species arose that had the power to, with intentionality, like affect every aspect of all of life on this Earth. And of course, that is our human species. And so the logical question to ask is, well, what have we done with that power to affect all of life on Earth? And as everyone here knows only too well, um, we've been really doing an atrocious job with that power. And this is a few years ago that the IPCC was sending a final warning on the climate crisis to act now. It's just too late. So this very article was written more than 2 years ago, and of course, not only have countries not acted on this climate crisis, but they just keep doubling down on making it worse and worse. And many of you are probably familiar with a chart that looks something like this, like showing what our current greenhouse gas emissions look like and how if they continue even close to the current growth, it will be hitting a 3 degree plus increase in global temperatures by the end of the century, which scientists say are catastrophic. Um, and the scary thing is that even if we drastically change what we're doing and actually limit that warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, which we've already sort of blown through, even those scientists say is a prescription for disaster or not a safe target because of these cascading amplifying feedback effects that happen through the Earth climate system. But here's the thing, even like the climate chaos alone is such a scary and such a major, major thing affecting us. But even that is just a symptom of a far deeper underlying problem. And that is the vast ecological destruction that we are causing across the world. And just some core statistics, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, is in the last 50 years alone, there's been a 69% decline in animal populations. So this drastic, drastic decline just in the lifetime of most of us here in this call. We're now looking as a result of all of this at the sixth great extinction of species since life began on Earth. This is the first one not caused by things like asteroids or whatever, but caused by one species' intentional actions. We're looking at the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide by the middle of this century. In fact, there's just a news item came out a week or so ago that we've passed the tipping point on that. And the UN forecasts that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by the middle of this century. But of all the statistics, the one that actually blows me away the most is this one, that by 2050, at current rates, there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. Just mind-blowing. So we need to ask ourselves, how did we get to this place? And well, Mary Elizabeth was talking about this book I wrote some years back called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And this book, like Mary Elizabeth said, it looked at the different ways in which cultures make meaning out of the universe from the earliest days to the present. And I'm not going to go into all that in detail now, but the key essence that arose, the key sort of insight that arose from that book is simply this, that culture shapes values. And those values are what actually shape the course of history. And by the same token, the values that we hold today, the dominant values of our society today, are what will shape the future. And if we look at those values that are dominant today, I think what we can understand about them primarily is that they are based on separation. I always think this picture is iconic. of what I mean by that. Like here are a whole set of people standing together, but completely disconnected from each other, disconnected through their technology, and also just as disconnected from the food they're about to eat, not even thinking where it might have come from, probably for the most part. Just living in these very isolated sort of bubbles of their sort of techno-enhanced reality. But if we go one level down, it's valuable to look at what is that modern story of separation, things that are usually implicit in most of the normal conversations that take place in the world today, but usually not understood to be so clearly around that. So one is this sense of nature basically being just a machine. Another is around that is humans being fundamentally separate from nature. And there's another story that sees humans as being essentially selfish and competitive. And in fact, we're told that human progress arises from these things. It's because of our competitive nature and because of nature basically being a machine that we've able to conquer nature. And that's what's been the cause of human progress. From all that, there's a sense that the earth is really nothing but just a resource to exploit for human benefit. And as a result of all of these underlying sort of sense of separation, ultimately, what we're told in our society, the purpose of life itself is really just to get wealthy and powerful. And then you're a winner. You're not like a loser, as is said nowadays in our political discourse. And now we're so used to this worldview and it's become so pervasive that it's easy to think, well, this is just the way it is, right? This is how humans are. This is how people make sense of the world. But actually, it's a unique worldview that only emerged in one time and place in history, in early modern Europe. And yeah, Francis Bacon was one of the sort of prophets of this scientific age, at the beginning of the scientific revolution at that time. And there was a sense of excitement that he put out there, which gave this generations of people the sense of why this was such a powerful new way of thinking, because it could enable us, in his words, to establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe. And then we as humans could render ourselves masters and possessors of nature. And the Europeans at that time took these ideas very seriously, not just applying to the rest of life on Earth, but applying to other human beings, basically. And with that sense of conquering nature, they also went ahead and then conquered other continents. This is like this kind of idealized picture that they love to think of themselves as these sort of heroic conquerors coming to this new world and the indigenous people in awe of their grandeur and all this mythos that then as conquerors they put out there over around the world. And that worldview of separation through this conquest of the rest of life spread to the rest of the world. It's a worldview that basically sees nature as a resource and other people as resources, which leads to these two very pernicious implicit assumptions. One is human supremacy, the sense that humans have a moral right to do whatever they want to the rest of life on Earth. And along with this European conquest and colonialism came white supremacy, this very pathological sense that those who have white skin somehow intrinsically better than people with skin of other colors. And that led to these fundamental values for extraction and exploitation, driving everything that gets done, which led to the rise of global capitalism, which really we can understand capitalism as really being the economic manifestation of this system of extraction and exploitation that arose at that time. And really, global capitalism is what has taken over this world as the most significant driving force, to the point that at this point, out of the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 of them are not even nation states, but are transnational corporations. And the whole point of a transnational corporation is to grow its earnings and value for shareholders as quickly and as much as possible, indefinitely. And this is the thing, global capitalism is based on perpetual growth. You're all familiar with this kind of chart, right? Like what they call the price to earnings ratio, which kind of captures this notion that the value that shareholders give to a company is not just what they're earning right now, but the multiple of what they're earning right now based on the growth that they expect of those earnings in the future. So this is a system designed basically to mint billionaires. And as such, it's done a great job. It's led to the greatest inequality in history, where the wealthiest couple of dozen billionaires in the world today own as much wealth as half the entire world's population of 4 billion people. And it's a system that is inherently unsustainable. It's basically based on these core design principles, maximizing shareholder returns, keep growing at all costs, seeing material consumption basically as a proxy of welfare, of human welfare, and seeing non-human nature again as a resource to exploit, which leads to this directive of our entire system, monetize everything as fast as possible, turn humans into basically conditioned consumers, and exploit every available resource on Earth. And as systems go, it's really been the most successful system, really, probably in history, because it's done exactly what that directive told it to do. So when system scientists looking at the Earth systems in recent history, when they've studied the way in which production and consumption has increased, what they've seen is what they call the Great Acceleration. That ever since the end of the Second World War, there's been this explosive increase in virtually every measure of production, every measure of consumption of the Earth's resources. And that's something that is forecast to continue to grow. Mainstream economists forecast a tripling of the global GDP, or gross domestic product, between now and the middle of this century. And it's as a result of that that we are rapidly heading for a precipice. A group of scientists, um, led by Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Institute, created a model some years back of the safe operating space for humanity, which is that little circle in green in the middle of this chart. And what they've studied the ways in which we've broken through those planetary boundaries. Um, and in fact, a couple more of those since this chart got created have been blown through. So almost every one of these planetary boundaries has now been exceeded drastically, which is why scientists are giving these warnings to humanity. Just a few years back, thousands of scientists co-signed a statement saying basically soon it will be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. They called this article World Scientists Warning to Humanity, a second notice, since one had been delivered 10 or more years earlier. Another earth scientist, Professor Hans Schellnhuber, says about if we continue down the present path, there's a very big risk we will end our civilization. And UN Secretary General tells the world leaders we're on a path of collective suicide. So is this where we're headed? And so this is the the question we need to ask ourselves. Where are we headed this future? And if we look back historically, which I did particularly in that book, The Patterning Instinct, what we see is there's only been a couple of times in history where there's been a complete transformation in the very meaning making, the very like lived experience of virtually every part of what each of us as human beings does in life. One is that shift from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, which began about 10,000 years ago and took a few thousand years to take effect. The second one came with the rise of the scientific revolution, which we just touched on a few minutes ago, um, and the rise of the modern world. Well, almost everyone who looks at this current century agrees that we're entering a phase of just as major a transformation this century. The question is, where is that transformation going to take us? Well, in general, I think we can detect three possible scenarios. One is the possibility of a global civilizational collapse, basically, just as those scientists were warning us about. where we just basically do the overshoot, and maybe, probably, if this were to happen, it would be the greatest catastrophe in all human history, would lead to the greatest mass suffering and mega deaths of like beyond unimaginable proportions. And it's something to really to be avoided at all costs. There's another scenario, which is you can think of as Fortress Earth, where the small elite basically fortresses themselves off, barricades themselves off, enjoying all the the sort of technological AI and genetic enhancement and this kind of sense of neurally connecting themselves with technology and all the rest of it, while most people are left to suffer basically the essentially a collapse in the rest of Earth. Now, from a moral standpoint, I would say that that might be even more morally egregious than a total collapse in itself, this kind of lifeboat ethics that is underlying that. But there is a third scenario, which is this possibility of finding a place of sustainable flourishing, somehow out of this chaos that we're entering into right now. And that's what we're going to explore right now for the rest of today's session. This vision of what has been called by many people increasingly an ecological civilization or an eco-civilization. And to get there, and here's the thing, it would require every bit as big a transformation as these other transformations in history. But in this case, it would be a transformation, if you will, of almost like our world's operating system. The very basis on which our system is designed would have to change from this system of global capitalism to one that is based on an affirmation of life. Essentially, what we'd be talking about is moving from the basis of civilization from one that's wealth-based to one that is life-based. And in simple terms, we can look at it as really creating a cultural and economic system that promotes sustainable flourishing for humans and Earth, with the overriding objective, quite simply, to create the conditions for all people to flourish as part of a thriving, living Earth. And the thing to recognize that this vision and this possibility is not just one small group of people that devised this good idea. Let's make this happen. This is something that basically just kind of crystallizes the ideas from so many endless, countless movements that many of you are going to be very familiar with around the world, from indigenous models of life-affirming values like Buen Vivir or Sumac Corsé in Latin America to Ubuntu in sub-Saharan Africa. It embodies these ideas of permaculture principles, rights of nature movements, transition towns, theory of the commons, and organization of people in commons-based self-organized groups, the degrowth movement, agroecology. It has a spiritual underpinning with everything from deep ecology, engaged Buddhism, traditional Chinese principles, Christian liberation theology, ecological economics, moving into political ideas, anti-globalization movement, eco-socialism, LGBTQ rights, and again, back to traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous people. It's a whole group, a whole wide array of people who share ultimately, implicitly, the same vision of basically a life-affirming system that we can move towards. And let's look at what that means, what a life-affirming system means. And because part of what an ecological civilization is about is really taking its inspiration from how living systems themselves organize. And when we look at ecosystems as they are on Earth, they can remain resilient and healthy for millions of years throughout all the perturbations of exogenous factors, basically until humans come along, essentially, and begin to destroy them. And if we look at this understanding of how it is that ecosystems can do that, we need to look at some of the sort of keys of nature itself as nature evolved on Earth. And a key thing to understand, maybe the most important thing to understand about nature itself on Earth, is that it is not selfish, as our modern worldview tells us that life is, but quite the opposite. If you look back billions of years ago, and trace how life took jumps in complexity throughout its history, we see there's only been a few really big jumps from single simple cells to complex cells known as eukaryotes, from from those eukaryotes to multicellular life, and then to the rise of simple animals and then mammals. And in every case, every one of these big steps in life took place not because some group outcompeted some other group, but because they discovered ways to increase in cooperation, where one group, one species learned by cooperating with another group, and they actually created basically something that was greater than the whole. Life evolved through cooperation. In the words of systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And what is interesting is that this most recent shift in evolution with the rise of hominids also came about through yet another jump in increasing cooperation. The humans, we evolved as humans, not through, again, learning how to be more selfish or more competitive, but quite the opposite, learning how to cooperate with each other in ways that was really quite unique. Humans evolved to be cooperative. And what we mean by that is millions of years ago, before modern Homo sapiens evolved, early hominids found themselves there on the savannah. They had been used to being more in forest, and they were vulnerable to predators. And those groups that learned to collaborate together were the most successful in staying alive and thriving. And over millions of years, as we began to evolve into modern Homo sapiens, human identity expanded from just self and kin to include the entire group, the entire band that we were connected with. And that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is actually what differentiates us most significantly from other primates. And psychologists look at this and they've identified what they see in humans, what they call moral emotions. Things like compassion, or like a sense of shame if we do something wrong, or guilt, or gratitude if people do something for us, or embarrassment if we sort of break out of our sort of social norms. These are things we feel deeply in us. And you get people like Richard Dawkins, for example, talking about the selfish gene, saying we have to overcome our nature in order not to be selfish. But what evolutionary biology actually tells us is that we don't just act morally because we think we should and we have to overcome something in ourselves. We do it because it feels right. And this is an insight that traditional cultures everywhere around the world understood fundamentally. We mentioned Ubuntu before, like in sub-Saharan Africa, this overriding moral principle of Ubuntu basically translates as I am because you are. It's like our very identity is embedded in those others around us. Here in North America, the Lakota tribe have this similar concept called Mitakuye Oyasin. We are all related. And when they're saying that, they're not just talking about each other around them in that group. They're talking about all of life around them because they see all living sentient beings as cousins, as part of the family. So if we look a little deeper, what are the core principles of ecosystems that arise from nature's secret, if you will? I'm going to go through each of these just quickly to give you a sense of these principles, because these are the principles that work for life and that equally well can work and do work for human ways of organizing. So, and to begin with is a sense of symbiosis, or mutually beneficial symbiosis. And to understand what that means, like, say you just walk into a forest, what you're seeing around you, all around what's going on, is this ways in which different species are working together to create the abundance you experience. Plants photosynthesize, provide nourishment for all the other animals. Insects pollinate those plants. Animals transport their seeds, and they fertilize the soil to help those plants to grow. The fungus takes all the litter and regenerates it into other minerals that help. And the fungus themselves have mycorrhizal networks that help to transport nutrients for the trees in the forest and to elsewhere in the forest. So it's this continual dance, if you will, of symbiosis that we see around us. where each party gains from a reciprocal relationship. Well, how does that translate to human society? To concepts like fairness, justice, equity, and a deep respect for individual dignity. So another key insight about nature is that it's a hierarchy where each part of it is part of a greater whole and has like other wholes within it. And that leads to a very core concept for an eco-civilization of fractal flourishing. This recognition that the health of the whole system requires the flourishing of each part. So in opposition to this modern notion that everything's a zero-sum game and my success means somebody else has got to failure, has got to fail. The notion of fractal flourishing is recognizing that there's a ways in which I can flourish as part of a greater flourishing of everything around me. And that is actually what leads to the deepest, most sustainable flourishing for all. And then there is the principle of diversity, that a system's health depends on differentiation and integration. And that leads in human society to a recognition of the inherent right of each person and community to participate in cultural, political, and economic power. And then ecosystems have another principle of balance, where every part is in a harmonious relationship with the entire system. If you look at the system as a whole, well, this leads quite obviously in our economics to the vision of a steady state economy with equitable distribution of wealth and power. Another key thing about nature is really quite simply, literally, grassroots self-autonomy. That each blade of grass does its thing, not because some tree tells it what to do or some animal tells it what to do, but because this is how it evolved to do its own fractal flourishing, do its own way of making itself flourish, and as a part of making the rest of life flourish. Similarly, in human society, this leads to the concept of what we call subsidiarity, which means pushing decision making to the lowest or most local possible level in the system. And then there's a notion of embeddedness, recognizing humanity as part of the natural world, not separate from it, which leads to this notion of tending our Mother Earth rather than trying to control her. And finally, this concept of regeneration. Like nature, everything regenerates. And similarly, we can use that to look for sustainable flourishing into the long-term future. This is probably best expressed by the Iroquois Confederacy that talked about in their constitution, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. So if you look at all this, what does this lead to? Basically, it's a transformation in values, an emphasis on the quality of life rather than material possessions, basing our political, social, and economic choices on our shared humanity with justice and dignity for all, and building civilization's future on the basis of symbiosis with the living earth, not trying to conquer it, where the flourishing of the natural world itself is a foundational principle. So this leads to core principles um, of what an eco-civilization will look like, after which we'll go into just touching on a sense of what some of those tangible realities might look like. So it's helpful to kind of contrast this with our dominant culture so we can see the differences we're talking about. So in place of human supremacy, claiming this innate superiority of humans to destroy ecosystems, is the intrinsic value of all life. In place of the primacy of capital, is the primacy of human dignity. In place of commoditization and homogenization is heterogeneity and diversity. In place of hierarchical structures is subsidiarity. Rather than structural inequality, we're talking about structural equity. And rather than designing our entire system with incentives for selfish behavior, we design it for cooperation. So let's just touch on, we won't be able to go into too much detail, and this is what I really go into in this book I've written. What would it look like in practice? So one of the things to notice when we're talking about this transformation is it does affect every aspect of what we call civilization. It's not just about changing our economics, but changing our technology, our relationship with the living earth, our agriculture, our governance, our law, our culture and community. And these just give you a taster of some of the kind of things we will be looking at in an eco-civilization, which I'll touch on right now in just a little bit more detail. So, for example, the very measurement of our economy through gross domestic product, like right now, politicians are measured on how well the economy is growing compared to last year, which of course is completely unsustainable. There's this notion of a well-being economy, which can be measured not by just looking at GDP, but at things like what are called general progress indicators, like factoring negatives, like income inequality, pollution, or crime, and positives like volunteer work, household work, or education, to come to genuine progress rather than this ridiculous GDP that just measures how quickly we're consuming the earth. We'd look at thinking of economics in this fundamentally different way, which Kate Raworth, you're probably familiar with her book, Donut Economics, does a great job of describing that. Really thinking of the economy in general as this kind of donut, if you will, where there's that ceiling, similar to what we looked at earlier, those planetary boundaries that we are now overshooting. And that's the ceiling that defines how our economy should work within. And similarly, there's a social foundation, the basics that should be expected for a safe and just space for humanity, and everything like housing, health, education, income, social equity, etc. And the goal of economics is really to move humanity inside that donut rather than outside it, which is where we are right now. A big result of that would be a drastic reduction in global income inequality. We'd have a global wealth tax, a wealth cap on billionaires and centimillionaires. We'd have universal basic services offered freely to people. And a big concept, which is really crucial to this, this flourishing future, is the concept of the commons, which we can think of as basically any source of sustenance or well-being that hasn't yet been appropriated, either by the state or by private ownership. And if you think about what that means, what the commons is, basically there's nature's contribution to it. There's everything, the atmosphere, fresh water, the sunshine, soil, oceans, all that we inherit from life itself. And there's the human ancestral contribution, things we just take for granted, like language, cultural traditions, basic technical know-how, scientific knowledge. All these are part of the commons that is really, every one of us is born into and really has as our heritage. And you can look at that almost like this, imagine it almost like layers from nature to these core cultural traditions to just more recent thousands of years of what we get from the civilization around the world. And then from technology in recent centuries, like electricity, industrialization. And then just in recent decades, microprocessors, computer code, the internet. All that is this incredible wealth that is available to all of us. And then somebody comes along, does a couple of tweaks to this entire massive wealth we inherited and copyrights it and calls it Facebook. Um, and suddenly you get somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, whose net worth is now about $180 billion, basically taking all that global wealth. And because of these few tweaks, and it takes it all for himself, when about half the world's population is earning less than $5.50 a day, which is the minimum that people need for basic nutrition and a normal life expectancy. So what we're really looking at in the way the world works is this massive commonwealth should be available to everyone. It's essentially get like hijacked, almost like stolen, if you will, and like applied through this sort of wealth pump to this small elite. But that commonwealth can actually be shared. And this is what I see as a fundamental bastion, if you will, of an eco-civilization. It's called a universal basic income. It's also called like a commons dividend. It's basically a dividend of that commonwealth that should be available to everybody. And it's an unconditional monthly payment to every adult, sufficient to meet their basic needs. And it recognizes, it's on the recognition that purposeful work is an integral part of human flourishing. People worry about the idea of a UBI because they say, well, everyone's selfish and lazy and greedy. So they just lay on their couch and just watch TV and like get addicted to alcohol or whatever if we just give them all the money rather than force them to work. That's fundamentally different from how humans actually are because they have a fundamental need to feel valued by community. And these pilot programs of UBI that have been applied around the world consistently report that they lead to a reduction in everything basically bad: crime, child mortality, malnutrition, truancy, teenage pregnancy, alcohol consumption, and an increase in the goods, health, gender equality, school performance, and even entrepreneurial activity. Similarly, we've looked earlier how corporations are designed to basically extract and exploit. We can look at redesigning those corporations themselves so they exist for human needs rather than for shareholder returns. Some of you may be familiar of some of these concepts like a benefit corporation or B Corps, which basically causes corporations to recharter so they're legally required to consider the impact of what they do on their workers, customers, suppliers, community, environment. Um, well, that's a great choice, and some good high quality companies have made that choice. But the problem is that it's had virtually zero impact on the way the world works because there's no big corporation is ever going to do that because what they're all about is actually just optimizing for shareholders. They're never going to reduce that optimization. But in an eco-civilization, imagine what it would be like if that a triple bottom line of not just profit, but people and planet was required for corporate charters. So basically, every one of those big corporations had to have their charters renewed every 5 years. It could only happen at the discretion of a community-based panel chosen by sortition, just like we choose jurors to reduce the risk of corruption. And corporations would suddenly be subject not just to the risk of financial bankruptcy, but social or environmental bankruptcy. It would lead to a fundamental transformation of how those corporations made their decisions, how they got valued, and what the CEOs and the board felt they needed to do. And one of the things it would lead to, in fact, is this major change, a circular economy that tends to increase employment while reducing waste, with products designed for repair and recycling, sourcing from recycled materials, virtually eliminating waste. And we'd be looking at cities designed in ecological principles, with things like community gardens on every block, energy efficient designs, aquaponics, rooftop gardens, cars banned from city centers, and basically essential services always within a 20-minute walk. Outside of the cities, we'd look at agroecology replacing global industrial monocrops based on permaculture and regenerative agriculture principles, which lead to more biodiversity for crops, more water and carbon efficiency, the virtual elimination of synthetic fertilizer and the elimination of this mass globalized torture of factory farming that is such a blot on the earth today. And this kind of agriculture has been shown to be as productive as industrial agriculture, but without the devastating effects. In technology, we wouldn't reject technology, but we could transform it also to enable the global commons and what's called a distributed ledger. So right now, the reason technology is so destructive, one reason, is because the control of data is centralized for people, for these companies like Facebook, Amazon, Uber, Google, Airbnb, or whatever. But the possibility exists to decentralize that kind of data so that the control passes to people in general rather than to one centralized core group that is essentially enclosed that data. That empowers collective action, enables people to cooperate in coordinated scale, and is being done and shown to work in many different parts of our economy. Culturally, we need to shift from what is called by Rian Eisler, who's written brilliantly on this. What we currently have is a domination system, a system of authoritarian, hierarchical social and economic structures, basically based on patriarchy, which is so pervasive worldwide, with high degree of abuse and violence, subordination of women and the sense of femininity to men, and this notion of masculinity, and everything around it, there's beliefs and stories that justify domination and violence. And Rian Eisler writes in this great book, Nurturing Our Humanity, about the possibility of moving to a partnership system, which is more equitable, equal valuing of male and female stereotypes, respect and trust with low degree of violence. And basically, our culture itself would give high value to empathic and caring relations. In governance, we'd be looking at this possibility of polycentric governance. So again, from this place of subsidiarity, where power is distributed all the way to neighborhoods, and there's multiple centers of this semi-autonomous decision making. Um, and it fractally expands to community, city, bioregion, nature, and ultimately the entire globe. But power is always kept at the level at which it's most feasible to keep it to the local side. And then at that global level, we'll be looking at things like a Rights of Nature Declaration of the UN that puts the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity, giving personhood to ecosystems, rivers, high-functioning mammals, and defining ecocide, the intentional destruction of an ecosystem, as an international crime. Along with that, there's this vision written about by E.O. Wilson really well in this book, Half Earth. There's an initiative to set aside 50% of the planet for non-human nature under indigenous stewardship as a way of maintaining our biodiversity. And at the really bigger level, we can sort of build this planetary consciousness. The idea of is this through a hub and spoke network of cosmo-local connection. So it's not just about being local and it's not just about being global, but just like nature itself has these hub and spoke networks in every way in which it's organized, similarly, we'd be looking at having a place-based identity, local community focus, face-to-face interactions, building citizen networks with trust and agency locally, and at the same time having a planetary consciousness with internet-based platforms like Facebook converted to the commons. So they optimize for all of us as humanity, and a sense of cosmopolitanism with global citizenship, where we celebrate diversity while we recognize our deep interdependence. And if you can imagine this going on into the future, over time, you can almost see humanity itself becoming like a connected superorganism, like an emergent, self-organized collective intelligence where we as humanity begin to see ourselves and the living earth as an integrated whole. And just to leave you this kind of great vision is right now we all know that we live in the Anthropocene, right? This period of with basically defined by the ideology of human supremacy, where human impact has reached geological proportions, a period that's destructive of life and biodiversity, that's inherently unsustainable. And the eco-philosopher Glenn Albrecht has come up with this great term, the symbiocene, imagining this long era based on the principle of symbiosis, of the mutual beneficial flourishing of humans and the living earth, where we use technology for regenerative, life-affirming practices, a period that could potentially be very long-lived. And basically, we become a civilization learning how to tend Mother Earth. And maybe through that, we can finally regenerate this beautiful planet that we inherited. So that's the the prepared part of today that I'll leave you with. And for people who just kind of want to follow any more about what I've written, you can, find my work on jeremylent.com. These books, The Patterning Instinct, The Web of Meaning, are available. And this new book, Eco-Civilization, Making a World That Works for All, will be coming out May 2026. Melville House is the publisher. And you can also join me and others on the Deep Transformation Network. And there's the web domain down there. We're a global community of about 5,000 or so people really having live monthly events and connecting with each other in discussions on the feed, exploring pathways toward an ecological civilization. But now let me stop the share and maybe just turn to you, Mary Elizabeth, before we do anything more, just if you have something to add right now.
Jeremy, that that was mind-blowing. Um, Thank you so very much. I have I have heard you speak on this topic a few times, and I always learn so much from you and gain fresh perspective. Thank you so very much for what you've shared.
Well, thank you.